Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest installment of the Integrating Doctrine and Diversity series. My name is Michael Donnelly Boylan. I'm the Associate Dean for Enrollment and Strategic Initiatives here at Roger Williams University School of Law. And before we begin, I want to take a moment to reflect on the lands on which our campus resides here at Roger Williams. And so we acknowledge and honor the Narragansett and Pokanoket people and SOAM's, the original name of the land on which our campus resides. We also acknowledge that this country would not exist if it wasn't for the free enslaved labor of Black people. And we recognize that the town of Bristol and the very land that our campus resides on has benefited significantly from the trade of enslaved people from Africa. With that, I would like to introduce Assistant Dean Nicole DeStefano, who will take this panel over. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Michael. I am so thankful that everybody is here today. Not only is there the constant stress about the rule of law, but it's also a really hard time to make a webinar, given finals and grading and grading and grading and more grading. And also, thank you for this is what I envision is going to be the last integrating doctrine and diversity for this year until next academic year. And so thank you to all of you 4 years later who are still attending these webinars. That's amazing. Also, I would like to do a shameless self-promotion and say, oh no, oh no. Okay, there we go. So, this is a casebook called Race and the Foundations of American Law, and it just came out 2 weeks ago. And I am one of the authors on it. It is really a collaboration from a bunch of authors here at Roger Williams, and I am so proud of it. I remember being in law school and lugging around those red casebooks, and to think that I now have a red casebook with my name on it is too much. If you're interested, reach out to your Aspen rep about getting a comped copy of it so you can review it and see if it's something that might be interesting to you in your class. But to today, um, I've been considering the topic today, expanding doctrinal dialogue with foreign and international current events for over a year and really struggling about how to do right by the topic. I was reading the ALS listserv, Women in Law listserv last year, and I thought, oh, well, how can I contribute to the broader discussion of having these conversations in classes? Um, and I was really interested in inviting students affiliated with jurists to speak. And so last year we sort of planned this whole thing, and it ended up being really charged and really partisan and not at all what I had in mind. So I heard from one of my mentors to take a step back, to think about it, and to kind of come back with a fresh perspective. And I feel like that is what we did this year. And so the conversation is just as important now than it was a year ago, now that we're in challenging times. The question of how or if to integrate foreign and international current affairs content is different across schools and communities and classes and teachers. But we hope today to provide some basics on how you might do this work if you choose to do this work, or in some cases, the work is thrust upon you. And so, how to react to that. So, let's get started. Um, the reason I chose our panelists today is because I'm so inspired by their work. In order to really hear their perspectives, I think for today, I usually don't do much by way of introduction, but I want to give the full, big, ugly, hairy introduction so you really understand how amazing our guests are today. Emily Bazzotti Cardenas' scholarly pursuits and pedagogical focus intersect the domains of art and cultural heritage law, with specific focus on Latin America. Professor Bezzotti, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Cardenas research centers on the interrelation between the law and the arts within both national and international contexts. This research is informed by her academic background in art history. The focus of her scholarly work revolves around the convergence of cultural heritage law, human rights, and social justice. One of the most significant aspects of her published work is the examination of cultural heritage as a means of both expression and marginalization. In her scholarly work, Professor Emily has extensively investigated the utilization of acts of plunder, destruction, and occasionally the construction of cultural heritage artifacts as a means of exerting oppression and persecution. Emily is the chair of the Cultural Heritage section of the American Society of International Law, the vice chair of the International Division of the ABA's Forum on the Entertainment and Sports Industries, and an executive committee member of the AALS Art Law section. Prior to joining the faculty at Cal Western, Emily was an adjunct professor at Florida A&M Law and Barry University, Dwayne O. Andrea School of Law. As an attorney, Emily practiced in the areas of art and entertainment law, including in intellectual property, contracts, immigration, and civil litigation. Emily currently teaches property, copyright, art and heritage law, and Latinos and the law, although I hope not all at the same time. After that very long introduction, sorry, Emily, but you're cool. My first question is, how do you think your background, your experience, your identity allows you to or compels you to integrate foreign and international content into your classes?
Well, thank you, Nicole, first of all, for that very nice introduction. And thank you to Nicole and Roger Williams for inviting me to speak today. I really look forward to this really fruitful and obviously very relevant conversation. I think from the outside, art and cultural heritage doesn't seem like areas that would naturally connect to foreign or international law or even legal instruction in general, but they obviously very much do in both personal and in a structural way. So my background in cultural heritage law and in art history means I'm really constantly thinking about how laws cross borders, right? So who gets to define value, who gets to define ownership and identity, especially when objects and traditions move between countries or get taken or destroyed. So these aren't really just questions of property or kind of museum and art law policy, but it also delves into question of sovereignty, of colonialism, right, of state responsibility. So for me, bringing in international law isn't really a side note or a special topic. It's part of how I want my students to understand the foundations of our legal systems. And obviously, on a more personal level, as a Latina scholar, I feel deeply connected to the ways that, our laws shape our history and our belonging and even our like collective memories, right? So when we're talking about heritage and communities who heritage has been silenced or sold or appropriated, I think it's really important to integrate foreign and international perspectives into my teachings, right? It's not just kind of relevant, but it's necessary. And it's how I think students see that law is really just never domestic, right? There's always a global history and a power dynamic, especially when we're talking about cultural objects or expropriated land and even human rights.
Thanks. I really connect with that answer. Like that's the point of integrating doctrine and diversity, right? These issues, they're not on the side. They're part of the whole thing. And, at least in my opinion, we have been treating them as side issues for too long and sort of let's reclaim the truth. And Greg will talk a little bit more about the truth later. But Emily, can you give us some examples of how you integrate this content into property law, which seems like, for better or worse, like the quintessential American law class?
Of course. So honestly, I gotta say, I love challenging the idea of property as this purely domestic doctrinal and for a lot of students this very dry one out class because it in truth property law is shaped by global forces whether we choose to teach it that way or not. So when it comes to property law, first of all, I always remind my students that our entire land system in the US comes out of an English legal tradition, right? It's not neutral or uniquely American, whatever that means, right? It's built on concepts like conquest, the title by discovery, right? And a very particular way in which the English thought about ownership, right? That all has been imported here and imposed here. So even if we're thinking that we're teaching a very quintessential American doctrinal course or domestic subject like property, right? We're actually teaching a version of the law that has international and specifically colonial roots. So in my class, every semester, well, we went from a six credit to now 4 credits. So it's a little difficult, but I usually start off second class right at the beginning talking about slavery. And so early in the semester, I bring up the Antelope case, which is from the 1820s. And it's a important moment where the US Supreme Court had to decide whether hundreds of enslaved Africans found on a seized ship were considered property, right? And the court literally treated them as property under international law. And this can be jarring to students, right? And so we dig into how international treaties, how what's called the law of nations, right? Like these colonial legal norms and really kind of US interests all converge to legally recognize people as chattels. So it pushes back on this idea that property is just land or just contracts, right? It's this legal construction, one that is kind of embedded in these systems of power. And so I pair that case with the Amistad, which I'm sure some of you have watched the movie or have read, right? And we talk about, the opposite, where the court rules in favor of these enslaved Africans' freedom, right? But the whole dispute is still framed around property claims. Who owns them? Were they cargo? And what do these international treaties say, right? And so students get to see how personhood and property are in tension and kind of from both a domestic but obviously with international issues that are carved in, which at its core is a human rights issue. And then obviously in property, I talk about Johnson v. McIntosh, which is our classical origin story of American property case. And of course, I, for one, cannot talk about Johnson v. McIntosh without bringing in like the international doctrine of discovery and how that was used to justify colonial land seizures. So Johnson, is something that I bring in to still talk about how those colonial frameworks and property have really uh, are really what haunts our legal frameworks today. And I also bring in, when I talk about adverse possession, I talk about different adverse possession systems in different countries and how that differs with our system. And, especially during, housing crises like we have now, how does that differ in different countries and whether this is about equality or thinking about survival for marginalized communities, and even something as dry as like the recording systems, which is something that students hate learning, right? And it's something that is very neutral, right, to ensure certainty of title. And I always ask students to question themselves, certainty of title, but for whom, right? Especially when we think about ownership claims that are rooted in informal or communal practices that the law doesn't realize. So a long story short, right? Even property seems like the most kind of American of the law classes, the most domestic. I actually think it's a perfect place to bring in international perspectives. And obviously, my other classes like cultural heritage, Latinos in the law, and even copyright, I think is much easier and naturally fit. But property is obviously shaped by these international histories and power and legal systems. So I try to integrate it as much as possible when we're thinking about doctrine.
So that reminds me of so there's a piece of land. It's 255 acres that was owned by Brown University. And they just gave the land back to the tribe. And it's like I could see it from out my window if my window was on a in my office, if it was on a different part of the building. But and you think like, oh, but that doesn't have anything to do with property law. That's like this current event thing that happened. But when you explain it like that, when you explain that property law is descended from the doctrine of discovery, and it's descended from these things that happened in colonial times at other places and from England, and you think, my goodness, there's so many connections to all of this. I felt like property law was something that I read in a book, and it wasn't like so alive. But the way you make it sounds so alive and exciting.
I don't think my students would agree with that, but yes, I
I mean,
definitely.
you did start by saying that some people might think that it was dry and boring. I might have been one of those people. Um, so I'm going to add Greg to the conversation. So it pains me to say this to Greg's face, but he is one of the coolest people that I've ever met. Um, this is Dr. Greg P. Noon, PhD, JD. He is the executive director and a senior peace fellow for the Public International Law and Policy Group, which is a global pro bono law firm. And Greg was nominated for, no, the law firm was nominated for the 2005 Nobel Peace Prize. Greg has conducted atrocity crime investigations, justice system assessments, as well as human rights and international humanitarian trainings in over 60 countries. Greg worked for the U.S. Institute of Peace, is a retired captain in the U.S. Navy with over 30 years of service as a judge advocate. Greg held command 3 times, served at the Defense Institute of International Legal Studies, Naval Justice School, the Pentagon, and deployed multiple times. Among his personal awards are the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and 2 Defense Meritorious Service Medals. Greg currently co-leads the Sudan and Kenya programs and serves as senior legal advisor for the Ukraine Accountability Initiative. Previously, he led the Yemen Track 2 disciplinary team, served as the senior legal advisor for the Human Rights Documentation Solutions Project. Greg has conducted justice system assessments in Uganda and Cote d'Ivoire, as well as provided transitional justice assistance in post-Gaddafi Libya and to the Syrian opposition. Greg was also part of the international effort investigating the Myanmar government's atrocities committed against their Rohingya population. He worked as an investigator in the refugee camps in Bangladesh and as one of the legal experts on the report's findings. And in addition to all of that, he somehow manages to find time to teach evidence negotiation, interviewing and counseling, genocide and atrocity crimes, criminal procedure, and international law. Whew, Greg.
Didn't think you'd make it.
Did I miss anything?
No, I think you got all of it. Yeah.
And an all-around cool guy. After that very long introduction, my first question for you is, how do you think your background, your experience, and your identity allows you to or compels you to integrate foreign and international content into your classes?
Yeah, first and foremost, Nicole, thank you for having me. Thank you to Roger Williams and all the other sponsors. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Emily. Emily mentioned the book and the movie Amistad, which was actually filmed in Newport, Rhode Island, which is just right over from Bristol, Rhode Island. I was living in Newport at the time they filmed it. So I think, Nicole, I've been fortunate in a couple different ways. First of all, I've been fortunate to experience firsthand a lot of different things in a lot of different places. I've worked in over 60 countries. I've been to 98 countries. And most of that is sponsored. Most of that travel was paid for by Uncle Sam. So my dad always figured, wow, you must have figured it out if you can get someone else to make you travel around the world. Secondly, I was fortunate in that one of my professors in law school was a prosecutor at Nuremberg. And that always fascinated me. And so moving forward, when I was in Rwanda, before I left for Rwanda after the genocide, I was able to reconnect with that professor and say, you were the last person to prosecute a genocide. What are your tips? And so I've been able to have these connections both here at home, back in academia, also in the military, but also these connections around the world. And really, what most people, when I talk to most people here in America, and they ask about travel, or is it safe, or is that dangerous? The short answer is it's not usually what mom and pop sitting on the front porch think it is. It's a lot different. And so part of this is bringing all of this to the classroom to really open the eyes of students who may have traveled themselves and maybe even traveled more than I did when I was their age, and others who have not, whose world has probably been if you drew a circle in 100 square miles, that's pretty much it. So to kind of expand the worldview and make sure that people understand that it's more than just what happened on I-95 or in the local, high school state football game. There's a lot more going on out there. And at the end of it, people all want the same thing. They want their kids to have a better life. They want their family to be free from torture and abuse and authoritarianism. They want to be able to feed their family and make a living. So really, there's a lot more in common than there is in differences. And so that's one of my through lines that I always talk about in the classroom.
Thanks, Greg. Can you give us some examples of how you integrate the content into your Crim Pro and evidence classes?
Sure. So I just mentioned Rwanda. My team was tasked with training the 39 surviving prosecutors at the end of the genocide. At the end of the genocide, the international community came in, set up the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and put it in Arusha, Tanzania. Meanwhile, the Rwandans themselves had about 135,000 people in lockup, with very few dossiers on any of them. They had just passed a new law where they could prosecute genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Most countries don't have that on the books, ready, set, go to when that happens. And so our job was to train them in their own law. And the law was really modeled after the adversarial system and brought in new concepts like plea bargains and immunity. And so that was the task set out before us. So we trained the prosecutors, we trained the investigators. Ultimately, we trained judges and the defense bar. I also spent time in El Salvador when El Salvador in the 90s was moving from an investigative or an inquisitorial system, depending on whether or not you find that offensive if you're from that system, to an adversarial system. And again, these concepts, these criminal procedure concepts, these evidence concepts, how do we prove genocide? The front page of the news, and I have great respect for journalists. My daughter is one, but the front page will often call something a genocide that's not a genocide. We'll call something a war crime that maybe isn't a war crime. Maybe it's worse. Maybe it's crimes against humanity. So we're always working with the fact that words matter and facts matter. And so bringing that into that kind of constant conversation in both those classes, as well as other classes, that we have to really make sure we understand what we need to do to get from point A to point B.
That's great. And talking about language is a good transition to my next question, which is for Emily. Emily, I devoured your piece. His ship has sailed, expelling Columbus from cultural heritage law, or on SSRN, it's decolonizing cultural heritage law. And there's a piece of this that I was hoping you could talk about a bit today. And I chose this excerpt because although it is specific to cultural heritage law, it's general enough to be applicable to all law professors because, like Greg was talking about, it's about our use of language. And so this is a very long excerpt, but here we go. Scholars have opined that the periodization of pre-Columbian studies by its own nomenclature has helped consolidate the fiction of the non-West. This mythic divide aids in the fictional divide between the notion of the civilized and the primitive. The paradox between the civilized West and the primitive non-West aids in the erasure of the history of violence, aggression, and colonization against indigenous people. When understood through a framework of settler colonialism, the use of colonial linguistics encourages this ongoing structure of invasion through quotidian society. As historian Patrick Wolfe explains, the practice of settler colonialism by Europeans employed the organizing grammar of race. The practice of what this author terms linguistic settler colonialism results in the othering of indigenous cultures in the Americas and further exacerbates cultural trauma of the present day. Through this critical analysis, it's evident that the use of pre Columbian is a form of linguistic subjugation and exploitation of indigenous communities, and thus must be eliminated from legal vernacular. And you continue exposure to dehumanizing terms, symbols, or messages exposes indigenous communities to continued trauma. The celebration of Columbus, through his inclusion in legal and quotidian vernacular, reinforces negative stereotypes of indigenous people as wild and uncivilized. These negative stereotypes are often used to justify legal actions taken against indigenous populations. This was most evident in the violent and aggressive treatment of indigenous protesters during the Standing Rock protests of the Dakota Access Pipeline. A report from the American Psychological Association credited what they call the Christopher Columbus narrative with these negative stereotypes, which are leveraged more broadly to justify harm against indigenous people. The report concluded within every facet of American society, through the elimination of words used to celebrate Columbus, the historical trauma associated with settler colonialism can be acknowledged and reconstructed. The etymological reformation, while not directly remedial, may counter false narratives and prevent the erasure of indigenous voices and experience. So wow, first of all, I read this and I thought that all law professors, maybe all of us here, but specifically all law professors, could benefit hearing more about this. So, can you talk a little bit about this piece and how traumatic or colonized language can be hurting our students and even ourselves?
So yes, that was a very long, a long excerpt from that piece. But probably the precipice of this piece was that I was reading, I was doing a lot of research, and I kept seeing this term, pre-Columbian, and um, making these designations of artifacts and monuments that belong to indigenous groups or former indigenous groups, right, before they were eliminated. And I kept thinking, why are we referencing the heritage that was destroyed by the very person who destroyed it as part of the marker between what constitutes indigenous heritage and what constitutes colonial heritage? And I thought that this dichotomy was completely outrageous. So honestly, it's something that I'm continuing to think about, especially as I teach these subjects, right, that are tied to history, and power and identity. And so for me, I think language absolutely shapes how students experience the classroom, right? And it's not just about using obviously harmful terms, it's also everyday academic or legal terms that we use that carry a lot of historical baggage. So, for example, in property, terms like black acre and white acre, which we've obviously all have seen a million times in property law, if you've taken the bar exam, if not, if you've taken a property class, right? These seem totally neutral, but they're not, right? They come out of this long tradition of using color-coded names for land based on rent payments or land use by a specific group. And so, in a country where property law has been used to exclude Black communities from land ownership, right, and to reinforce redlining, uphold racially restrictive covenants, right, casually assigning the term Black acre for a piece of land that might be less valued, right, reinforces the underlying message, even unintentionally. So that's kind of a small example how legal language can quietly carry this baggage. And so we need to be more intentional, even with hypotheticals in the classroom. It's not really about being overly sensitive. It's about being aware how these terms may land with students and, what histories are behind that. And so in my writing, I've looked at terms like pre-Columbian, which in an academic setting also sounds very neutral, but actually reflects this colonial framework that erases entire civilization. And when that kind of language shows up in research or in class without discussion, it can feel very alienating, especially for Indigenous students or students from marginalized community. And so I think law professors specifically have to be willing to pause and ask, where does this language come from and who does it serve? One thing I try to do is I talk to my students about this early on is kind of to create this environment where we can question language itself, right? If we're using a legal term that has a traumatic or an exclusionary history, I invite the class to unpack that, right? How do students feel like that? Or they might be able to say, hey, this term doesn't sit right with me. Let's talk about why. So I try to model that openness with, case studies or, examples. I'm also very intentional about not just defaulting to Eurocentric narratives or identities. So I'll include examples in class that reflect communities like LGBTQ plus or BIPOC communities, right? So when students see themselves in the material. So if I talk about like a land transaction, right? I think they can engage more personally and honestly more critically. Um, but yeah, I think the real work happens in how we show up in class. So how we respond when students challenge a term or how we handle those uncomfortable moments in class. And I think it's important that we model the idea that language isn't fixed, right? It evolves over time, and so do we as professors.
I think that that's like the biggest takeaway that I got from this. I don't specifically remember using the word pre-Columbian in class, but I probably did and gave it absolutely no thought at all. And now I'm like, okay, well, so I'm not going to do that again. And I don't find that to be threatening, which I think some people do. I think some people might approach that as, oh my God, I've made all these mistakes. Or, well, now you're telling me there's another word I can't use. When instead, I think it's like this great opportunity to have learned something, to pass it on. Like the next time this happens, I will email my students a link to your paper and say, and this is where I learned it. And we can do better, uplift the voices of people who have written about this, and then like share that with the students who are going to be in many cases advocates, and as advocates are going to have to choose our language in ways that promote advocacy and our clients. And this is a tool in the toolbox that I think not only is this critical for me, I don't want to offend a student without knowing it. I mean, maybe I want to offend a student totally knowledgeable about it, but I certainly don't want to do it accidentally. But I also want to give them the power when they become advocates to choose the words with intention that best suits their clients. Thank you, Emily. I absolutely thought it was, I loved it. I thought you had a great article. Everyone should read it. Um, the concept of trauma comes up all the time as a researcher, as a librarian, and as someone who teaches in a race class. Um, you discuss the examples of states which have begun to pass laws to facilitate the removal of offensive place names. And you also discuss how former Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, and now candidate for governor of New Mexico, formally declared the term squaw to be derogatory and ordered a task force to replace the names of valleys, lakes, creeks, and other federal sites that use that word. How should law professors engage with traumatic language? So, like, I think there is some concern that, well, I've heard a few things. One thing I've heard is like, oh, well, that's what the original document says. That's what I'm going to say. I've heard also, well, um, it's going to call more attention to the traumatic word if I like take a time out and break for it. How do you advise us? How do you advise us to engage with traumatic language? Do you have syllabus language that you recommend? Do you make this a part of establishing your class rules? Just overall, what type of advice do you have for us?
So I think this is something I'm still working on. I don't have syllabus language, but after thinking about it, I more potently, right, as I'm restructuring some of my classes, I think that would be a great way to kind of introduce students before they even get into the classroom that, this course might include cases or statutes or legal texts that might have outdated or offensive language, right? And then tell them like we don't include these materials in order to endorse that language, right? They're here because one, they were part of, the law initially, right? And we want to critically examine how the law was operated at that time, how it has changed, excuse me, and then hopefully avoid those types of problems in the future. So I think setting it up in the syllabus is a great way before you get into class. And then on like the first day of class, I think it's important to talk about, to kind of re-emphasize that we use respectful language in here, right? We're going to see harmful content that might be triggering, right? And I definitely talk about that in my art and cultural heritage law class and in my property class before we get into slavery, right? And so I also think it's important to give students shared ownership over the classroom and, tell them that these are the rules and you have the responsibility to engage responsibly. And I think it's also important to contextualize these offensive terms, right? Where they came from, the harm that it carries, right? And how they either have been legally challenged or removed, right? And that I think helps teach us how the law is evolving to kind of shape our collective memory, right? You might also want to offer students alternatives. Like if let's say that they're talking about a case and talking about language of a case, right? You might want to give them an alternative to a word to say. Um, so, obviously law is not neutral, right? And the language really does reflect that. And our job as professors is to teach students to read critically. And so they need to respond to that type of language with that type of critical thinking, but also with human compassion at the same time. So I feel like that was not, I don't have like specific examples, but I think it's just really important for our students to think about this from like the framework of not, you know, obviously students make mistakes, but we want them to be comfortable with speaking up in class at the same time.
Sure. So one of the things that come up in my class with written assignments is capitalizing B or W for black and white.
Mhm.
And so there is no uniformity on this.
Yeah.
So one of the professors, I capitalize B but not W. One of the other professors that I teach with capitalizes B and W, um, and L and I, and but what I do is I send out, we send out an email about it. We say, hey, this professor chooses this professor chooses this. Here are some articles. So, like, there's one, I think, from the AP. They wrote an article about, they wrote like an update to their style guide. So I'll
Yeah.
send that out. The Columbia Journalism Review put one out. There's an Atlantic article. Here, read about this and decide what you want to do and stick to it. Be
That's
consistent. And we
because
won't grade you for your decision, but your consistency, and do it with thought and intention instead of because we've always used pre-Columbian.
exactly. That's all. I think that's all that, I ask is that you be intentional with your language and actually have a thought process behind it.
Thanks, Emily. Greg, my question is simple. How do I talk about issues related to ongoing conflict without offending anyone? Just kidding. That's not simple. But the concept behind it is like, as a teacher, to Emily's point, I need to balance like offending people with the importance of discussing current events or even historical events with current ramifications. I need to get my lessons done, and I need to not traumatize or re-traumatize my students can come from anywhere in the world. What advice do you have for us on this?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I think a lot of Emily said was it was spot on, right? Is that open environment, and it really starts on day one. I've coached a lot of youth sports over the last couple of decades, and I always tell anyone else who's going to coach youth sports, the most important thing you do is the parents' meeting. Everything else will flow from there. So day one is really important. So whether it's in the syllabus or whether it's a discussion right out of the chute. Um, I think I've had a lot of success around the world training foreign militaries because I wasn't there to convince them I'm right. I was there to say, look, this is how the United States did it. This is how we made a mistake. This is how we think we fixed it. And here's an example of the fix. So to kind of do it with what I say is open hands, I think is very authentic and lets people know that they can challenge that or bring more things to the conversation. But as Emily said, respectfully, without rancor and vitriol. We're not here to pick teams. We're here to have an intellectual conversation. And I am a big believer, and I share this with the students. Dr. Hannah Holborn Gray, who was one of the first females to be a president of a major institution, she was president of the University of Chicago. She said education should not be intended to make people comfortable. It is meant to make people think. So that's important. If we're in a class, you sign up for a class that says genocide and atrocity crimes, you really shouldn't be surprised that there's going to be an awful lot of horrible things, and there are a lot people have done a lot of just despicable, ridiculous things in the past, and oh, by the way, ongoing today. Sam put a question in the chat talking about what taught crimes have elements and that they're terms of art. How do we handle class discussions when current events seems to check the boxes that international law is being violated, but the conclusion is divisive? That's law. Not everyone agrees that Karen Reed should be prosecuted for murder. And for those of you who don't know, Karen Reed is the next, big TV trial out here in New England, whether or not she killed her boyfriend or didn't kill her boyfriend. But there's going to be a discussion. Let's discuss the facts. Let's discuss how the facts fit into the law. And I think that's an important part in walking through and doing it in a way that they know you're not pitching for either team. That you are open to hearing their thought process, because that's exactly what you're encouraging, is them to think, well, what about this? What if we argued this? Great argument. Do we think it'll work? And kind of keep rolling along in that way.
Thanks, Greg. So here at Roger Williams in the Race and Foundations of American Law class, which is mandatory, we have a week on truth telling and transitional justice. I'm really excited about this idea of truth and memory. How do you approach the idea of truth and memory when discussing genocide? And are there examples you can share from your class?
Yeah, so whether it's genocide or whether it's negotiations or whether it's interviewing and counseling, one of the things that you're going to have to do is sit in front of people who've had the most horrible thing happen to a human being ever. I've sat across from women who had their entire family killed in front of their eyes. I sat across from women who were gang raped by the men who had come into the village to create this violence and fear. And the fact of the matter is, just like we talk about interviewing, counseling, and negotiations, you have to manage expectations. I can't tell that woman who lost her whole family that there's going to be a trial and these guys are going to be in jail and you're going to get, compensated. That's not how it goes. In fact, a lot of times when we do these investigations, what we're doing is creating the historical record. So that we know for a fact this happened. We did a methodologically sound survey and interviews and an investigation, and we can use that going forward. People talk about obviously the violence being committed in Ukraine by the Russians, and I tell people quite frankly, Vladimir Putin's never going to be in a courtroom ever. He's gonna die before that happens. In the private Smirnov, when he's done, he's going back to Siberia. He's never going to leave the farm. But there's that whole band of field grade officers, major, lieutenant colonel, who are in charge of these men who are raping women and stealing children and murdering POWs. They're in charge of those men. And we have a thing called command responsibility. And at some point, that colonel's going to want to take his family on vacation in Croatia, and his name's going to be on a list. And that might be 20, 30 years from now. So it's when we talk about transitional justice, we have to understand that it goes from everything from memorialization all the way to accountability and a whole lot of other ideas in between.
I really struggle with it, that because it seems like our justice system, as it currently is, isn't necessarily set up to glean the truth. And it's arguable whether it does a good job at justice either. Not a conversation for today. But I think like there is something about the adversarial process and the rules of evidence that don't necessarily get at the truth. And there's something to me that's beautiful about these sort of other transitional justice mechanisms that are about memorialization and um, highlighting the memories and stories of victims instead of retribution and the rules of evidence.
Right. No, I completely concur. And sometimes that's all we have. Not everybody's going to end up getting justice, like you say, whatever that means, getting justice done. But people need to feel heard. So whether you're out in a refugee camp or whether you're in the classroom, people need to feel heard. Not everyone in the room is going to agree with whatever that person's saying, and sometimes maybe it's me saying it. But people need to be heard, and there needs to be a thoughtful, mature, intellectual conversation.
Yeah, and I think that it's a way to sort of give dignity to humanity in a way that I'm not sure that we've exactly figured out how to do in the justice system. So my next question is for both of you. I feel some resistance from some professors, maybe even many professors, when discussing issues of foreign international law. I think partially because it's less familiar to us, and I think partially because it also implies issues of identity, race, and national origin, and often settler colonialism, language, socioeconomic status, religion, and gender. Why do you think 5 years past the summer of 2020, there is still resistance to integrating these topics into our doctrinal curriculum?
I can start. First of all, I think you're totally spot on. I think a lot of resistance comes from the fact that bringing foreign or international law, you know, is about kind of opening the door to some uncomfortable truths, right? About settler colonialism, about racism, inequality, right? Things that I think in the past 5 years, the US legal education has definitely, done a better job of not sidelining. But a lot of the resistance comes from the fact that, it's not just adding new material, it means rethinking the lens in which we teach, which is a little bit harder, right? We all can study, right? And learn a new subject. But rethinking how we teach and thinking the lens through which we think is just a much more, it's hard. And so once you start pulling on like this thread, it unravels a lot and I think can be really uncomfortable. Um, but that being said, I think there's also some practical pushbacks, right? People feel like they don't have time. They've got a certain amount of content to cover. Students are stressed about finding jobs, bar exam, and it feels like that if they're not directly tested on that topic, they'll get pushed back. And so that's why I think it's important to have conversations that can be integrated into doctrinal teaching, right? Not just as add-ons, but as how we teach cases, how we frame hypotheticals, right? Really talking about the law in that context. I'm still working on this, right? It's not a box I've completely checked, right? It's something that I'm actively figuring out each semester, specifically with property, right? But I do believe if we take the time to connect the dots between the doctrine and these issues, right? I think students will engage more deeply, right? And that I think that's really what sticks with them after they take the bar exam.
Yeah,
That's what I thought.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I completely agree. There is that kind of concept. Is this being tested? But we can have these smaller conversations. It doesn't have to be a stop. Let's talk about this for an hour. Just this last semester in criminal procedure, I was encouraging after class some students who were minorities to say more, right? Tell them your experience. I know for a fact that I've had students, I had a young black man in my class when asked about his experience with police, tell a very eye-opening experience to a lot of white kids in the class who've never thought of it that way. And so we need to share that. The young man's not trying to make a statement. He's just saying, no, this is where I come from. So socioeconomic, religion, gender, all of this. If the world was black and white, it'd be easy. The tough stuff's in the gray, and so kind of bring in the history, even if just small bites. I'll take a moment to talk about Supreme Court justices. I'll talk about where Rehnquist came from. That he began by pursuing minorities who are trying to vote in Arizona. That's where he begins. Right. And then he goes from there after he graduates from Stanford Law School. And I give them a little bit of history of the person writing this and makes them at least appreciate a little bit more about where it comes from. And so kind of D is the answer, Nicole, all of the above. And I whether we're talking domestically or whether we're talking about international law, we shouldn't be afraid to talk about race, religion, and politics, not in a political way, but the politics of Hungary is this. The politics of Ukraine is this. And that informs, the great Louis Henkin, who wrote the international law book that we all used in international law many years ago. The first sentence and the first page of chapter 1, first, comma, law is politics. And so we shouldn't shy away from that. And again, I'm not saying get on a soapbox and pitch for the red team or the blue team, but just recognize that these all have impact.
I think that there are two things that are really important in what you both said. One is if we other this content, our students notice, right? Like we're not doing this, we're not doing this in secret and it's not going to impact things. There are students in the classroom who are going to know that this is othered. And then I think like the point that Greg made about whether it's history or context or politics, going the extra mile to explain it, and place it in a place where there is some real world and some historical understanding behind it, even if it's only a few sentences, I think makes everything more relatable. And I think that it makes the students be able to connect with us and the doctrine more than they would if we just keep doing it in a bubble, which is unfortunately, I think, what we've been doing for a really long time. My next question is for both of you. There are two issues that are front of mind for the audience today. One is, in this current climate, is it safe to discuss issues related to the Ukraine or the Middle East or Haiti? How can we exercise what academic freedom we do have with the threats, real or perceived, to university professors? Can either or both of you share your perspective on this?
I mean, I think it's part of academic freedom gives us the space to bring these issues into the classroom, right? I mean, we still have to be, like I said before, intentional, right? And try to ground things in the law, history, and, human rights, right? You don't take it in a political stance. And I make it very clear that disagreement is fine, but disrespect isn't. And I can give an example. So the Monday after October 7th, I was scheduled to teach a class on cultural heritage during armed conflict. So the timing wasn't something that I could just ignore that issue, right? It felt important to acknowledge what was happening, especially because the material connected so directly to it, right? And so I opened class by saying something like I didn't take a political stance or anything, but to remind students that when we're talking about international law, right, it's not just these international conventions, right? It's not just theory or history, right? We're talking about how war and armed conflict impacts people's lives in real time, right? And these frameworks are connected to real people, real suffering, and ongoing violence, right? We can't talk about war crimes, specifically for me, war crimes and treaty obligations when it comes to cultural heritage in the abstract without, holding space for the human cost of that. Right. And I think it was a heavy moment, but it felt like it set the tone for a more grounded and empathetic conversation. And, I don't think it's about feeling safe for us, right? It's not avoiding these conversations, it's helping students learn how to engage with these really hard issues in a ways that they're being thoughtful and respectful, right? And that's part of what we're here to do is to facilitate those conversations. So I think academic freedom actually helps us to facilitate those conversations.
Yeah, I agree. And it's so important to have these conversations. If we can't have them in a classroom, how do we expect people to have them over Thanksgiving with the uncle they only see once a year who, So look, the fact of the matter is that time and time again, I've heard feedback from students who said, thank you for guiding this discussion. I have not been able to have this discussion with family members, with friends, with this, with that. We have to have these. And as Emily said, we're talking about armed conflict. There's a part when I teach the law of armed conflict where a big part of it is, okay, now we're going to talk about targeting. What's targetable? And I'm like, we can hit that. We can't hit that. We can hit that. And then I always pause. The first time I talk about, targeting something, and I say, look, I'm not trying to be a tough guy. I'm not trying to be Rambo or Vin Diesel or whoever your tough guy is. I'm just telling you, war is awful and destructive and chaotic and deadly. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of people are going to die. And so when I'm talking about targeting, we hopefully are talking about targeting the right things that don't turn into war crimes. So kind of that constant touch base, kind of that feel of what's going on in the class, because sometimes I'll say something and I don't, I try not to talk like a military guy, but I'll say something and you can kind of see somebody go back in their seat a little bit. And I'll just kind of pause and say, this is what it is. Civilians are going to die. I don't care how high tech your weaponry is, civilians are going to die. And I do lectures on Capitol Hill for staffers, making sure that they know when their boss authorizes this, civilians are going to die. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you. And so it's that kind of real, authentic conversation in a space where, as Emily said, people can do it respectfully and thoughtfully.
Thanks for that perspective from both of you. The second question that I think is top of mind is, and this is the most common question I get all the time, all around the country. How do I manage a conversation that spins out of control? These issues are real. They're particularly real to our students who are from impacted areas or with family and friends in places of instability or humanitarian crisis. Ignoring the issues in the classroom does not make them less real to these people. But as someone with little experience in managing conversations about genocide or armed conflict, how do I introduce these issues without having the conversations go awry?
I mean, I think preparation is crucial, right? And setting ground rules at the beginning of the semester about how we engage with these sensitive topics. And it's important that, you tell them, you need to listen actively, right? You have to respond respectfully. And also, you have to prioritize students' lived experiences, right? If there are students who are from those impacted areas, it's important to consider that when you are framing your argument. If a conversation begins to escalate, I sometimes will pause the discussion, and might reframe the question in order for it to get back on track. I might sometimes even defer the discussion to a next class to let the emotions settle down. It's better to slow down than to allow the harm I think, to occur in real time. But honestly, sometimes you might not even be prepared for how a conversation will unfold. There are sometimes in art law where discussions will go, which doesn't seem like it would, but in discussions, especially when we talk about colonial lootings, where it can get there can be really heated conversations. And I think, when students might step over the line, it's important to, as the professor, to put your foot down when a student crosses the line. But at the same time, you have to allow a space for students to argue and to disagree and to work through those hard ideas. It's honestly a balance. I don't think I've perfected it yet, but it's not something that you can avoid. So I think having these conversations and keep practicing class after class is how you get better at responding to those conversations that go awry.
Yeah, I concur. And everyone, like I said earlier, everyone needs to feel heard, right? And you do have to control the classroom, right? There can't be side conversations. There can't be mutterings. One of my kids was once asked in a AP psychology class, "How would you describe your parents' parenting style?" And she said, "Well, we were free range kids with an iron fist." So you can let the conversation, be organic, but at some point, like Emily said, you may need to pause it and say, okay, 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 stop. Let's go here, and then we'll go to you. And we're going to take this one at a time. And then again, relaying it back to the facts and the law. Whatever the issue is, at the end of the day, we're lawyers. I don't have the capacity to solve the Palestinian-Israeli issue. But we can talk about specific instances and apply those facts, apply them to the law, and say, this is a war crime. This could constitute crimes against humanity, et cetera, et cetera.
I One of the things that I do is try to give students some information about trauma. And whether I do that in the syllabus or you do that in class, I am very, and again, this is somewhat unique to the fact that I teach a mandatory race class, and we're going to, it's just part of it. We're going to talk about really uncomfortable things and you might be traumatized. And explaining that when someone is experiencing a trauma reaction, they might not be able to be professional. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be respectful, but it does mean that maybe in that moment, being respectful of that person is giving them space to walk out of the classroom, take a few deep breaths, grab some water, come back in class. Maybe my conception of, what is professional needs to change a little to accommodate the lived experiences of people in my classroom. And so what I try to do is give people the heads up that that's okay. And does that stop trauma? No. Does it stop conversations from going out of control? No. But I at least like to that being a way to sort of think about it as these are real human beings with real lived experiences, and trauma is not something that can be controlled. Re-traumatization is real, racial trauma is real, and that comes with behaviors that, you might hope wouldn't be in a classroom, but might be someday. And we'll see what happens. So we are at an hour, but I did want to give you both the opportunity to give final thoughts. Final thoughts. What does the future hold? What should we do to prepare ourselves? Emily, you first.
Wow. What does the future hold? TBD. We will see, right? I think for purposes of what to do, right? I'm still struggling with that, but I think I when it comes to thinking about diverse and conflicting viewpoints, I what helps me is to go to different panels on this stuff. And I know that sounds like a cop out, but I do think that it helps me become less rigid in my own beliefs and more open to talking about sensitive conversations with students in the classroom when I'm confronted with opposing viewpoints, especially in this particular time, right? And I think just speaking with students, I think that's my favorite and the most incredibly valuable way of getting through times like this and navigating these topics is speaking with the students themselves to help me think more thoughtfully and builds a classroom where they feel safe, especially during this time.
Yeah, great advice as always, Emily. I think, especially when we teach like 3 or 4 hour classes and we take a break, being available to students to kind of have those side conversations. When we do, peace negotiations, we always joke that the real work is done at the coffee break. So it's often those small spaces that give us that. But the other thing, Nicole, to your question about, well, okay, so what do we do? How do we continue doing what we all love doing, intellectually curious? Read, listen, watch, explore, all these things. And we're all lifelong learners. Continue to learn more about things that maybe you didn't know about. I think you'll be surprised that there's always something that when it comes across your vision, you kind of go, "Hey, I didn't know that. I didn't know that's where they got the name for such and such. I didn't know that word meant that. I
Yeah.
had no idea." And I think I'm a well-read person who's, but we're always, just continue being intellectually curious. I think serves all of us pretty well.
I think sometimes the life of a law professor can be a bit lonely unless you look out for these opportunities. And, some of the ways that this series has been helpful is that I've heard that some faculties get together and they play like a section of it and then they discuss it. And that's like, I think the best part of it is, maybe you don't need to sit with your faculty and watch an entire hour, but maybe there's something that will spark conversation because we can be in community with each other. It may feel a little lonely or siloed sometimes, but there is this space for us to be in community, and I think that is one of the ways that I have learned and grown is to listen to sort of all of you, um, and our students, because that's another group of people you can be in community with and really learn from. And so that concludes our fourth year of integrating doctrine and diversity programming. Thank you to Roger Williams Law School and our co-sponsors of CUNY Law, Jurist, University of California, Berkeley School of Law, George Washington University School of Law, and the Anti-Racist Development Institute at Penn State Dickinson Law. I am so proud to work at a law school that continues to support integrating doctrine and diversity right now in 2025. Thank you to those who make this happen. You know who you are, but it is so important to me that you all know how thankful I am. If all goes well, I will see you next year for the fifth year of integrating doctrine and diversity programming. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.